So we will now have our first presentation this morning from Professor Mark Spencer. You've perhaps already seen in the bios, but I'll say again that Mark is a professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. Mark is an author with an immense number of publications, 60 articles, a major book, The Irreducibility of the Human Person, more forthcoming. Mark works on the human person, on questions of aesthetics, and many other issues. We're very, very privileged to have Mark also as our academic advisor, though, as you said yesterday, we always multiply your titles. I think we'll go back eventually to the Fellow for Metaphysics and Aesthetics, because it just sounds so cool. Mark has been working very closely with the Hildebrand Project now over the last, I think, about 6 years, and is the organizer of many of our academic events, including reading groups. Some of you have perhaps participated. So it's really a privilege that you continue to find time for us as your many other activities take off. Mark is also here with his wife, Susanna, who has become an institution. The two of you are kind of institution of the summer seminar. So we're delighted that you can be here. And last but not least, or among their activities, well, I should say first, they have 4 children. I've had the privilege of being in their home and meeting them. And they have also recently launched a new Substack called Living with Lady Philosophy, which those of us who've read it all highly recommend, full of interesting literary and cultural commentary, film reviews. So a little plug for this wonderful new thing that you've just launched in the last couple of months, right? So we hope you carry on. So without further ado, Mark Spencer.
Thanks, John Henry, and thanks to all of you for being here. At the beginning of a seminar on the challenge of community, we need to spend some time thinking about what communities are and why people should live in communities. Many of us nowadays think about community in individualistic terms. That is, we tend to think about communities as primarily worthwhile because they serve our individual good, our individual flourishing. But I'm going to argue this morning that this worldview is corrosive to community and to human flourishing. By contrast to individualism, I'll introduce the personalist view, on which persons are essentially communal and relational, intrinsically meant for community. Personalism was developed by thinkers like Dietrich von Hildebrand and Jacques Maritain during the early 20th century, partly in response to threats to communities and persons, like individualism and collectivism. Collectivism will be discussed by Dr. Crosby tomorrow. I want to begin by defining community. Here, I'm going to be drawing on a work that will be central to our discussions this week, and it was mentioned several times last night during the introductions, Hildebrand's book, Metaphysics of Community. In a broad sense, on Hildebrand's view, a community is any interpersonal relationship. Even 2 persons having a conversation constitutes a community in this broad sense. But that very loose sort of community is deepened in what Hildebrand, following Adolf Reinach, calls social acts. Social acts are acts that only have meaning, only are what they are meant to be, when they are heard by another person. Just expressing information isn't like this. Even when I talk to myself, my speech has meaning. But a social act, like a command, a promise, or a request, only makes sense in relation to another person. A command is only a command if one commands another person. A promise only exists if it is made to another. Another way of deepening community is by issuing what Hildebrand calls declared responses. I often have a felt need to declare my feelings towards others, to tell you that I love you, or to tell you that I hate you. But this act of declaring my feelings isn't complete until it impacts you, until you feel my feelings and have your own felt response. My declaration of love isn't complete unless it warms you. My declaration of hatred requires you to be wounded. The declaration and the response here aren't so much distinct acts as they are a single organic whole. Especially if you and I mutually declare love for each other, a new relationship between I and thou comes into being. When two persons, especially those attracted by romantic or spousal love, mutually declare their love for one another, there is an experience of union and spiritual contact. This mutual giving and receiving of selves is physically expressed by what Hildebrand calls interpenetrating looks of love. With social acts, and even more with declared responses, and with this union of love, we have deeper senses of community than what exists in a mere conversation. In still other cases of deepening community, you and I can engage in acts of joint consciousness, as when we look together at a painting or together watch a film. Not doing these things just side by side, but at the same time, but mentally taking each other by the hand and looking together, being conscious of the object together. Or we can come together and jointly perform an act or make a response, like if we together make a request of someone, or together mourn the loss of a friend. The jointly performed act is experienced as a new kind of act, distinct from acts done alone. Human persons can become, in a certain qualified sense, parts of a larger communal subject, the we that jointly performs these acts. In an even narrower and more proper sense, a community is a whole that encompasses persons and bestows on them new unity, new meaning or purpose, beyond their unity or purpose as individuals. Communities like families, circles of friends, nations, states, and the church aren't like conversations, declared responses, or joint actions, which only exist so long as people are performing those acts. Rather, these communities have an enduring structure or nature. Unlike a conversation, which can be carried on however the interlocutors want, there's an essential structure to, for example, marriage, that is not up to the spouses. For example, a marriage can only be between one man and one woman. It is founded upon and calls for a specific kind of love, spousal love. It endures so long as both spouses are alive, regardless of their acts and feelings towards one another. It involves various set rights and duties. Communities in this narrower, more proper sense of the word community are almost like new substances, new wholes over and above their members. They can, in a sense, perform actions, and each gives new meaning and new purpose to its members, uniting them in a distinct way. Among communities in this more proper sense, Hildebrand distinguishes what he calls formal communities and material communities. Material communities arise organically from the mutual experiences and acts of the members. Material communities are based upon the shared interests, values, loves, or way of life. They include circles of friends, romantic partnerships, and nations or cultures. Formal communities, by contrast, arise from deliberate social acts, like forming a contract, or drawing up rules that define the boundaries and purpose of a community and the rights and duties of the members. For example, what Hildebrand calls an association exists only because its members contracted to be part of it. Associations include things like nonprofits, businesses, clubs, any community that exists just because of a deliberate decision to form it, regardless of whether there are any personal or felt connections among the members. And some communities, like marriages and the church, have both material and formal aspects. Now that we have some sense for what's meant by the word community, and this will be deepened over the course of my talk and over the week as a whole, Let's turn now to the approach to community that's probably most prevalent in Western societies in the 21st century: individualism. When considering individualism and the personalist alternative to it, we need to think about what we human beings are. We need to know what we are fundamentally if we're going to understand how we are meant to live in community. I'll distinguish two ways of thinking about what each one of us is. First, considering us as merely individuals, and second, considering us as both persons and individuals. This distinction between person and individual comes from the medieval Thomistic and Franciscan traditions, but it was further developed in the 20th century by Thomistic personalists like Jacques Maritain, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, and Hans-Urs von Balthasar, Russian personalists like Nicholas Berdyaev, and Greek personalists like John Zizoulis. I don't have time this morning to consider all the differences among their views, but I'm going to use their distinction between person and individual. I want to first consider what it means to call us individuals, and then, after I discuss individualism, I'll talk about personhood. Etymologically, an individual is what cannot be divided, individuum, not dividable. This idea of not being able to be divided must be understood by contrast to categories or kinds of things. A category, like the genus animal, can be divided into many species, like blue whales, house sparrows, giant squids, human beings, and so on. Each animal species is an instance or example of the larger category, animal. In other words, the category animal can be divided into many parts, each of which is an example of that larger category. Each species category can in turn be divided into many members, each of which is an instance of the species. The human species, for example, is made up of many humans, each of which is an instance or example of the species, human. But an individual human cannot be divided into many parts, each of which is an instance of the whole. My parts, like my organs or my cells, are not instances or examples of me. I am indivisible into many instances of myself. It's in this sense that I cannot be divided, and I am an individual. As my mentor, Jorge Gracia, defined it, to be an individual is to not have instances. This inability to have instances is not a lack. Rather, it's a positive aspect, a perfection of being an individual. It's closely related to what medievals like Richard of St. Victor and modern personalists like John Crosby call our incommunicability. A universal kind, like animal or human, is entirely given or communicated to its instances or its members. That is, a kind like animal only exists in its instances, in individual animals. But each individual has the dignity of not being able to be absorbed into another in this way. As an individual, I belong to myself, not to examples or instances. I exist in my own right, as a complete whole, not as a mere part, property, or possession of another. However, while individuals do not have instances, individuals are instances of some kind or category. As an individual human being, I am an instance or example of the human species. As human, I'm the same as other humans, equal in my humanity to all of you. We each have the same powers and nature which define us as human. One individual of a species, insofar as it's an individual, can be substituted or replaced by another individual of that same species. We are distinct as individuals insofar as we are separated from one another. I have my matter, you have yours. I'm located here, you're located there. To be an individual is both to be equivalent to others and to be divided from them. It is to have borders that set me apart from other individuals. As a human, I have powers to perform acts like eating, breathing, digesting, moving, perceiving, thinking, willing, desiring. Each of these acts aims at some good, something desirable and fulfilling, like food, air, artifacts, objects of knowledge, and so on. To become happy and fulfilled, I must achieve those goods. I must achieve food and knowledge and air and so forth. If I think of myself just as an individual, possessing myself and separated from others materially, then I will think of those powers as a set of private needs, and I will think of those goods as a set of private goods. I have the same kind of private needs as you. We both need food and shelter and knowledge and love and so forth. But my needs, insofar as they are individual needs, must be fulfilled here, within my material borders, and yours must be fulfilled there, where you are, in your material borders. If I acquire an individual good, like food or a place to live, then given the physical borders between us, you cannot acquire the exact same individual good. If I have it, you can't have it. The view I'm calling individualism holds that human beings are nothing but individuals, as I've just defined that word. That is, beings who do not have instances, who are instances of humankind, who are separated from others, and who naturally strive for private, non-shareable goods. I don't have time this morning to consider the views of particular individualists, people like John Locke, Thomas Paine, John Stuart Mill, John Rawls, or Robert Nozick, or to the conflicts among them. Instead, I want to consider some general reasons why individualists think that individual humans would form communities. An individualist might reason as follows. I, this human individual, experience myself as one who, when I act, I freely confer value upon other things. By my choices and my preferences, I decide the worth that things will have for me. Since nothing can give what it does not have, and since I can give value to other things, I must already have value in myself, such that I can confer it on other things. To have value in myself is to be worth respecting for my own sake, not as a means to other goods. In other words, as a conscious, free individual, I am an end and not a mere means. That is, I am one to whom goods should be given. The individual goods I need to flourish, or at least the conditions required to achieve them, are due to me in justice. I have a natural right to them. Insofar as we are individuals, we only have powers to act in pursuit of individual goods, which contribute to our individual flourishing. If each of us has a right to the same kinds of goods, and if each of us, as individuals, is focused on our own needs, then in a world of scarce goods, we will end up desiring the same private goods, and conflict will result. If we are only individuals, then our basic condition is strife. While I have free sovereignty over everything within my physical borders, but not over you, and you have sovereignty over yourself, but not over me, we invariably are going to impinge upon one another, run up against each other, when we want the same things, with no way, it seems, to justly decide who gets the goods over which we're having a conflict. So a first reason why individuals would form a community is to minimize this conflict. Seeing the dangers of strife, we form a contract to create an authority that will adjudicate conflicts among individuals, keeping the peace and providing the conditions for individuals to achieve goods. This authority will ensure that individuals' rights are met as much as possible without infringing on each other's rights. It will ensure that, as much as possible, each person is respected as an end to whom goods are due, rather than treated as a mere means to others' good. If there's going to be peace among people, and if we're going to achieve the conditions needed for individual flourishing, I must give up some of my freedom to a communal authority who will protect me from your aggrandizement. A second, more positive reason for an individualist to form community is to effectively fulfill individual needs. I can produce some goods, like philosophy papers, and you can produce others, whatever it is you produce, but none of us can alone produce everything needed for flourishing. If we contract to pool our resources, though, we're each going to better fulfill our needs. Communities are practically necessary for achieving individual flourishing. Now, on either of these reasons, either to minimize conflict or to pool our resources so we can achieve flourishing, human beings form communities only as a means to individual flourishing. In no case here is a community a new unity, giving its members a new purpose and meaning beyond their individual purpose. Communities, on this view, are just collections of individuals pursuing their individual goods together. If individualism is true, then there are no communities in the proper sense that I defined before, except for associations, those communities established by formal fiat where we contractually define our relationships, rights, and duties. If individualism is true, then there are still communities in the broad sense of interpersonal relationships, but these too exist only for the sake of all parties achieving individual goods. Communities that seem to exist in a more robust material sense, like marriages or states or cultures, are really nothing but associations of individuals pursuing their individual good. Now, I think it's important to be aware of just how prevalent this way of thinking is. Many, perhaps even most, of the dominant political ideologies in our country today, conservative, liberal, progressive, are individualist. They hold that communities exist only to promote individual rights and flourishing. While apparently opposed political views, like, say, libertarianism and socialism, differ over the role that government should play in helping individuals achieve individual needs and rights, they fundamentally agree in holding that the purpose of a community like the state is only to fulfill individual needs and secure individual rights. At a more personal level, many people have an individualist view of friendship. Many of my students, for example, tell me that it's worth cultivating friendships only because friends provide each other with valuable experiences and because friends can provide support for each other's needs. Likewise, on an individualist view of marriage, two people get married just to fulfill their individual needs for companionship, sex, children, and material goods. One can even have an individualist view of the church. I enter the church to receive salvation, which I conceive as a private good, my personal union with God. We're thinking individualistically also when we consider human beings as defined by desires for individual goods, such as economic or sexual desires. The same is true when we treat individuals as consumers, or when we treat friendships, education, and other goods as investments in one's future. In each case, we are thinking that people aim only at fulfilling their individual desires and needs, even when they act together. In short, if I am only an individual, then my only powers are those whereby I seek individual goods, and so my only motivation for any act will be the pursuit of individual goods. If that's my only possible motivation, then there are only two ways in which I can relate to others. First, I can use them as means to my own good. Or second, I can recognize that they, being equal to me in their humanity, are ends and not mere means, and I can set up associations, like the state, that ensure that we are all treated as ends. But even here, the resulting community is just a means to our individual good. In no case does an individualist allow that we can form communities that give new meaning and new purpose to our life beyond the pursuit of individual goods. Furthermore, for the individualist, community is ultimately dispensable. While generally being a member of a community is practically necessary to achieve individual flourishing, it's not strictly necessary. If I'm able to achieve the goods I want and need all by myself, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, while individualism seems to rightly defend the dignity of human beings as ends in themselves and as unable to be reduced to being mere parts of communities, there are deep problems with the view and with the lifestyles to which it tends. We can begin to see these problems by considering what it is to be a person. Person, etymologically, is derived from the Latin persona and the Greek prosopon, a theatrical word for the mask worn in front of the face or eyes, pros ops, which signifies a character's role in a play. In Latin, persona denoted both a theatrical role and the legal role of a free man. In Roman law, a person is someone who is not a slave, but belongs to himself and is able to rule himself. As a theatrical role, personhood is for others. The actor wears a mask, a persona, to reveal who his character is to others. In its legal sense, a person belongs to himself and cannot be entirely given over to others. The later philosophical and theological history of the term person develops this idea that persons fundamentally exist both in themselves and for others. In Trinitarian theology, for example, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three persons, not in the sense of three roles that one God takes on, that would be the heresy of modalism, but in the sense of three subjects of the divine nature. Each entirely subsists in the divine nature, each is entirely his own, entirely incommunicable, unable to become a property or part of another, unable to have instances, but each is also only distinguished by relations of gift and receptivity towards the others. The Father, for example, just is distinguished by his relations of begetting the Son and spirating the Spirit. Analogously, calling myself a person picks out how I am a unique, incommunicable, self-possessing someone who has an individual nature, but is also entirely ordered to giving himself to others and receiving them. Each human person is an individual in the sense of being an instance of a species. I'm an instance of the human species, with the powers and needs consequent upon that species' nature. But each person is irreducible to, is not nothing but that individual nature. I am fundamentally a gift from God, one gratuitously created or given by God. Contrary to individualism, I am not a being who fundamentally exists apart from relations to other persons. If a personal God gives me my existence, then I am fundamentally relational, constituted by my relation to the divine persons. I am always already in relation to other persons, at least in relation to God, rather than just forming relations with others to achieve individual goods or ensure that others are respected as ends. We're now, I think, beginning to see some cracks in the individualist account of what we are and what our relation to communities is. Personalists argue that if individualism were true, then I could only relate to other persons as a means to my own individual good or as ends to whom individual goods are due. But, the personalists contend, I can relate to others in other ways than these. We can see some other ways that we relate to other persons by considering three ways that, according to Hildebrand, human acts can be motivated. First, we can be motivated to act by what we find subjectively satisfying. This is when I pursue things that I prefer or decide are pleasurable to me. For example, certain ice cream flavors have this importance for me, though they may not be satisfying to you. Right? I prefer chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream. You might like something else. One's subjectively satisfying to me, might not be satisfying to you, and that's all there is to it. Second, I can act for the sake of what is objectively fulfilling to persons, either myself or another. Certain goods objectively fulfill our natural needs, regardless of our subjective preferences, and we can be motivated to pursue these goods just because they fulfill those needs. For example, I can pursue the good of health by exercising and good diet, not because I necessarily enjoy those things, but because I know they fulfill my individual human nature. When I'm motivated by goods that are objectively fulfilling to persons, I can treat persons as ends to whom these goods are due. But third, we can act for the sake of what is important in itself or valuable. Things show up as important in themselves. For example, certain actions are just or unjust. Certain artworks are beautiful or ugly. And in virtue of these values, they call for a response. Injustice calls to be rectified. Beauty calls for admiration and reverence. Values like justice or beauty are due these responses, not as a means to a further end, and not because making that response is fulfilling to a person, and not because it's subjectively satisfying to make that response, but because those values are worthy of that response in themselves. Beauty is worthy of being admired. Justice is worthy of being pursued. I can relate to another person as a bearer of value as well. For example, when I revere and adore my wife and admire her as a whole person, being grateful to God for her existence and the gift she is, responding with tender affectivity to her beauty. When I do this, I'm not treating her as a means to my good, nor am I making myself a means to her good. I'm not trying to fulfill my objective needs or my subjective desires or hers. I'm not motivated by the fact that we are both ends to whom individual goods are due. Rather, I'm motivated by her value, her importance in herself. I'm revering her because she, as this whole person, embodies a value that intrinsically calls for these responses and is due them. According to individualism, my wife is substantially equivalent to all other human individuals, substantially distinct from others just by her distinct matter and location, and objectively replaceable by any other human individual. She is an end in herself, but that just means that she deserves individual goods, in the same way that any human individual deserves them. But in loving my wife, I directly see that that account is false. In loving her, I perceive and respond to a unique value or beauty in her. In addition to having the dignity of being a free and rational individual member of the human species, there is a unique value character to each person, which calls for a unique response. When I respond to my wife's unique value or anyone's unique value, I'm responding to them as whole persons in all of their particularity. Individualism fails to consider all the ways that human persons appear in experience, all the ways that we are motivated to act, and all the ways that we are related to one another. If I treat another person as a means to my individual good, say as a means to my subjective satisfaction, then I'm not relating to her as a unique whole person. Rather, I'm just considering those aspects of that person that can serve my needs or my desires. But also, if I just respect another person as an end to whom individual goods are due, I'm also not relating to her as a whole person. Treating another in this way, while it's better than using another as a means to my own good, requires me to treat the other just as an instance of human nature, another free individual entirely equivalent to me. If, as individualism holds, I can only relate to others in ways motivated by subjective satisfaction or objective goods, then I can never relate to others as whole, unique persons. But, contrary to individualism, I can come to know and respond to another as the whole individual person he or she is. Human acts like knowing, willing, loving, and feeling can be, in Hildebrand's terms, self-transcending. In these acts, I can go beyond, transcend, attending to myself and my needs, and I can make contact with a whole, valuable person who is other than me. Contrary to individualism, I don't just confer value on other things, and I don't merely have value in myself. Rather, I receive my value from another, God, and I respond to the value found in other beings, especially persons. This happens, for example, in social acts, declared responses, and joint actions, as I described earlier. Contrary to a major trope of modern epistemology, I am not first contained within my consciousness, such that I have to somehow figure out how to get out to the real world, reasoning from my own ideas to the existence of others. Rather, experientially, I first transcend myself. I am first and foremost aware of persons and things other than myself. Furthermore, I can make contact with persons in a way that I cannot make contact with non-personal things. When I am speaking to another, that other person, you, can make a free response, which I can't predict and to which I must in turn respond. Personalists, from Christians like Hildebrand and Max Scheler to Jews like Emmanuel Levinas and Martin Buber, are continually amazed by the ability of persons to respond to one another. In the responsiveness of your face and your voice, I find myself addressed by a person who is entirely other than me. I find myself called out of myself, called to respond, and so to responsibility. In the face-to-face and voice-to-voice relationship, you appear fundamentally as one who is worth responding to. The very look of your face and the sound of your voice calls me to respond responsibly, to make myself available to you, and to give myself to you. I respond to you first, not because I want something out of you, and not just to respect you as an end, but because the very value of your face calls me to respond to you. Before I start thinking about how you contribute to my flourishing, I have always already responded to your value. I am always already in a relationship with you that aims at more than anyone's individual good. These basic experiences help us to see that individualism, again, fails to adequately describe human experiences and motivations. If these self-transcending experiences of perceiving and responding to others' value have been correctly described, then some further aspects of persons' relationality have come to light. Persons are disposed to transcend themselves, to go beyond attention to their individual needs, and to perceive and respond to what is other than themselves for the sake of the other's value. This is not just to give the other individual goods, but to give them the response that they are due. Persons are disposed to reveal and give themselves in response to others. I am given to myself by God with the orientation to give myself to others and to respond to others. To be a person is to be intrinsically disposed to relate to other persons and their value. Our orientation towards self-transcendence and self-gift points to some of the personalist reasons as to why we should enter communities. I should be part of communities not just to overcome strife and not just to more effectively gain individual goods, but because value calls me out of myself into relationship with others for the sake of giving what is valuable its due. I am called to be a member of a community not only by the value of other persons, but also by the value of communities in the proper sense. I can relate to communities not just as mere collections of individuals, but as realities with their own value, irreducible to the value of their members. This happens, for example, when I grasp how my marriage calls me to build it up and to be grateful for it, not for the sake of fulfilling my or my wife's individual needs, but because the community of marriage as such calls for these responses. If individualism were true, then aside from contractual associations, there couldn't be communities that are new wholes over and above their members. But experiences like the one I just described, the experience of my marriage, directly show that there are such communities. As a person, I am fundamentally oriented to give myself to others, and thereby become a member of communities that are larger than myself, which give me new purpose and meaning beyond my individual good. A community of persons is, Jacques Maritain says, a community of wholes among wholes. Hildebrand notes how each person is a whole world of his own, an interior world of feelings, ideas, choices, desires, and so on. And yet, at an equally fundamental level, persons are constituted by an orientation towards what Hildebrand calls a moral enlargement by others, to become with others more than the complete whole one already is. Even when a person is entirely perfected as an individual, that person can become even more perfected by entering into communities of persons. Contrary to individualism, persons are not defined by sharp borders, because to be a person just is to be a gift for others. Personhood is intrinsically communal. I am constituted by my relations to God and to other human persons. I am always in community with God, and likewise, I am always a member of the community humanity. With all other human persons, I stand under the call of God to acts of self-transcending worship and love. To be a member of a community is to be ordered to give myself to the other members of that community. Since I am, from my very origin, a member of the community of humanity, I am always oriented to give myself to all other human persons in some way. But that means that my relations to others are not essentially defined by the potential for conflict and strife. Persons are not defined by competition for private goods, as mere individuals would be, but by the peace that comes from being disposed to give oneself to all others and to offer a due response for every value. Every instance of strife or competition among persons is a breakdown of this more fundamental peace. Hildebrand further shows how persons are intrinsically communal by observing that we experience ourselves as located in different kinds of space. We aren't just demarcated from one another and situated in physical space, but as persons, we are also situated in what he calls spiritual or interpersonal space. Spaces defined by intentional, self-transcending stances towards one another. In being part of the community of marriage, I have an experience of being located in my wife's heart, and of always being situated in relation to her, even when she is not physically near me. Our mutual love constitutes a sense of intimate interior space, what Hildebrand calls a kind of world that only the two of us inhabit and into which no one else can enter. Generally, every membership in a community in the proper sense includes some experience of spiritual space. If I were just oriented towards my individual good, and if I were just fundamentally related to others by being separated from them in physical space, as individualism has it, then I would not have these experiences of new shared spaces. But since, as a person, I am fundamentally constituted by an orientation to transcend myself and give myself to others, I can enter new spaces and be given new purposes. For some further examples, I experience myself as located in what Hildebrand calls a worldly public space with other citizens of my country, related to them by laws, by the shared pursuit of common goods, and by being under common authorities. I experience myself as spiritually standing before God with the rest of humanity in what he calls a metaphysical public space. To grasp myself as a person just is to experience myself located in a range of spiritual spaces together with others. All of this is missed if we think of ourselves only or fundamentally as individuals in physical space. Different kinds of community and the spaces they constitute will be explored throughout this seminar. The key thing now is to see that persons are irreducibly communal. Most communities are not formed by contract, but by shared participation in various kinds of value. Inasmuch as we together respond to the call of some value, or together with others bear some value, we enter a community. Value, as Hildebrand observes, and as Dr. Federico will explore further in 2 days, has a unifying value. A state is unified by the call of the values of law and authority. A friendship is united by the kinds of importance to which the friends are disposed to respond. Friends might come together through the shared love of beauty, or the shared pursuit of justice, or another value. Many communities come about primarily because of a shared value, not for the sake of attaining individual goods. A community resulting from the unifying power of value is a new whole, which confers new meaning on its members. That is, my life makes sense and has purpose, inasmuch as it's organized around certain values. While the members of communities might pursue objective goods or subjective satisfaction together, they are often more fundamentally bound together by jointly sharing in some value. They retain this meaning even when they fail to pursue goods together. We now have a personalist account of why persons are intrinsically members of communities. Having also seen why the theory of individualism is false, we're now in a better position to see just how detrimental an individual way of life is. Because individualism gives an inadequate account of what we are and of our motivations for entering community, individualism is inherently alienating. If I accept individualism, my thoughts about myself and other persons will diverge from what we really are and from awareness of how we actually live and what we can do. Individualism entails that I cannot transcend myself towards another as a unique whole. If I accept that, then I will misinterpret those acts in which I do transcend myself towards others. Individualism suggests that every human being is replaceable by another. If I accept that, then I will be unable to make sense of experiences in which others are presented to me as unique and irreplaceable. I will tend to explain those experiences away as illusory or misleading. I will try to think of even deeply material communities, like circles of friends, as merely contractual associations brought together for the sake of individual goods. And so I will fail to attend to all the ways that these communities call me to value response, and all the ways that I could make a gift of myself to others in these communities. Excuse me. I'll thereby miss out on the happiness that comes from making a gift of myself to others, or from responding to the value of other persons. We should expect that most individualists will experience dissonance, anxiety, and sadness arising from trying to understand and live out their acts in a way contrary to their nature. The views that we accept guide us to perform certain acts and not perform others. And so we should also expect that individualists will be increasingly unable to perform acts of self-transcendence or to experience others as uniquely valuable. A society populated by many individualists will exhibit an increasing number of these social ills because of its members' alienation from one another and from themselves. This is what we find in our individualist society. I'd like to close with some quick general suggestions as to how to live out personalism and to overcome the alienation that comes from living in an individualist society. First, we can internalize personalist philosophy, learning it, meditating on it, rehearsing its arguments internally and in conversation, so that we train our perceptions and our actions to habitually operating in a personalistic way. Second, we can consciously work on forming with others moral virtues of relating to others primarily by love, by shared response to value, and by self-gift and receptivity, and not by defense against encroachment from others or by contract for mutual benefit. Third, when fulfilling our individual needs, as we must, we can strive to do so not with the mindset that I am an end in myself who deserves individual goods, but that I am a bearer of a God-given value who is due these goods for the sake of that value. My value is not my private possession, but is for others. It does not separate me from others, but makes me a gift to them. I am due individual goods for the sake of living as a person who is a gift to others. Fourth, we can consciously attend to the material features of our communities, the loves and shared ways of life that constitute them, and we can stop trying to turn every community into a formal association. In both secular society and in the church, there's a strong tendency to formally and legally delineate, whenever there's a regular gathering of people, what each person's rights and duties are. We can resist this tendency by allowing more spontaneous communities, circles of friends, cultural groups, religious movements, without legally defining everything about them. Developing a love for communities without having to make them official, and learning to see that communities have real value without legal standing, can help move us away from an individualist mindset towards a more communal, personalistic, self-giving one. This in turn will make us happier in our lives as persons and as members of communities. What the personalist vision of the human person as meant for community offers us is ultimately a richer, more satisfying, more giving, and more divine way of life. Thank you.
Christopher. Okay, so we'll go to some questions now. We have maybe 15 minutes. We have a microphone in the back, and then I'll bring the mic to those of you in the front. I just want to maybe lead off with one question here, which is, so it seems to me that one doesn't have to have all that many moral commitments to essentially accept sort of the basics of the various individualisms that you laid out. So in that sense, there's a kind of uncontroversial character to it. Mm-hmm. I wonder whether you think that the personalist vision that you lay out, how much does that sort of move into the realm of moral philosophy, perhaps even faith? And the reason this even comes to mind is just given the particularly broken state of our world today, and the fact that for so many people, we just, at a very basic level, assume this kind of not necessarily the Sartrean view entirely of human relations, but nonetheless one in which, we're basically at odds with each other, and the best that we can do is to create sort of mediating structures to sort of limit conflict. So I'd just be very curious, because I know that when we go out into the world sometimes with our personalist ideas, they're sometimes met a little quizzically. Yeah.
So the vision I've laid out here, I think, is kind of we might call it sort of more robust or more core idea of personalism. We can have a sort of more broader and more diffuse idea of personalism. So the vision I've laid out here sees us as unique persons created by God, given our value by God. And so there is a sort of religious or faith element to that. But I think some of the experiences I pointed to here people have these experiences regardless of whether they have any faith commitment and regardless of their moral commitment. So I love this thing about the face-to-face relationship. So that comes from the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. Who's a great Lithuanian and French Jewish personalist of the 20th century. And so he sees, in the very, talking to another person, right? You come into the room and I see your face. I'm immediately called out of myself into relationship. Even if I immediately adopt an individualist mindset, the first movement of my heart is personalist, right? Is to respond to you as a person. So I think, if we're sort of trying to evangelize for personalism, starting with these experiences that don't presuppose anything about God or faith or religion or whatever, are key things to point to. Right? When my students say this thing about, I have friends because it enriches my life, right? It's another line for the resume. It's basically they talk about their friendships. Pointing to the actual experiences they have of their friends as real whole people and sort of giving them permission to pay attention to those and not always reframe things in individualist ways, that's a great first start, I think, for moving things in this direction.
Hey, Mark, thank you for your presentation. I appreciated it. I admired the way you made it seem like criticizing your account would also mean criticizing your marriage, so that's very intimidating on my part.
Yeah.
But I do have maybe a concern. So it seems like if we make the spousal love relation one primarily almost of justice, right? Responding to your wife in this way that she demands. I could foresee somebody taking that to mean that we actually ought to get rid of marriage as an exclusive institution in general, right? Because every time I come into contact with this other person, they demand a certain amount of full self-gift. By their nature, that's what we come into contact with. And it seems to me that you, not you specifically, but that one would then have to resort to sort of these more general defenses of, well, it's bad for society for something like this. It's bad for your children. And obviously we think it is bad for ourselves as well. But I'd be curious to hear what you think about what a personalist ought to say about why the exclusivity of something like marriage ought to be a part of our communal framework.
Yeah, good. I'm sympathetic to this objection, actually. I think there's a sense in which we do have a desire to, in a sense, give ourselves fully to every other human being. And that's called the church. And ultimately, we hopefully will do that, right? In the ultimate kingdom of heaven. So the objection is not wrong, I think. But it misses a great deal in terms of kind of the anatomy, the architecture of value, how value else shows up in our experience. I've talked about value here in very general terms, but there's all sorts of different kinds of value, and they each call for different sorts of responses, right? So beauty calls for one sort of response, and justice calls for another response. And when I see when we watch the Olympics in a couple weeks and see the great athletic prowess of these athletes, and we admire them, that'll call for yet another response. And some values have the structure of appealing only to certain others. Right? So some values are not for everyone. Right? And I think we see this in spousal love. Right? When you find yourself called to marriage with a particular other person, what you find there is an objective value. Right? They really have this importance, but it's a value that is meant only for you. Right? That only you should respond to, or it would be wrong for someone else to respond to them in that way, not because it's bad for society, maybe it is, but regardless of whether it's bad for society or regardless of what other moral norms it contravenes, this value, this mode of importance, addresses itself personally to me. Hildebrand talks about how certain values show up as a message from God. Right? That's the experiential content of them. There's something absolute here. That's the from God part. Right? And it's a message. It communicates something to me in particular. So attending to those sort of nuances in the way that values show up, I think, overcomes this sort of worry. We find something similar in nations. Right? I ought to respond to the United States, to the American culture, in a way that I should not respond to, say, the French culture, the Chinese culture, right? Because America is my country, right? It appeals to me in a way that it doesn't appeal to a citizen of another country. So that sort of for a particular person is part of the structure of value.
Okay, thank you. When you spoke about how even two persons can be a community at the outset and then unpack that, it was reminding me of a recent conversation I had with a group of Christian young professionals where there was a lot of division over whether you could have a conversation with an AI chatbot. And even these young Christian professionals, not everyone was in agreement, and some thought that this really could be a conversation, because of course people have devised these algorithms, and you're getting a response, and you're being summoned, and you're being prompted and queued. So I'm curious if you could maybe touch on why, because I presume you would say that's not a conversation, why and how to give an account for why interacting or simulated communication or conversation is not, and why that might also kind of reveal something of the individualism even among Christians who would otherwise not think that they fall prey to this.
Yeah, good. No, that's a great example. I suppose I'd want to distinguish maybe sort of a broader and improper sense of conversation from conversation in the proper sense. And conversation in the broader and improper sense of the word is the way that most people use the word conversation, which is sort of an exchange of information, right? Like I give you data, you give me data. That's how people treat conversations. My students talk about conversations in this way sometimes. And if that's all a conversation is, then sure, we could have a conversation with a chat bot or whatever, because all we're doing is giving and receiving information. Yeah, absolutely. Conversation in the proper sense of the word, in the personalist sense of the word, is not merely the giving and receiving of information, but the giving and receiving of persons, of selves, right? In a conversation, I'm not just trying to get all the knowledge I can out of you or get an interesting, stimulating experience out of you. I'm trying to reveal myself to you, right? And you're trying to reveal yourself to me. So the idea of person, I think, is more fundamental than the idea of conversation. I can't understand what's going on in a conversation unless I understand what a person is. A person as this unique, self-directing, self-governing, self-revealing whole who then can reveal themselves and is oriented to reveal themselves to another. So I would think, like, in arguing about these things, the thing is not to try to start at the level of conversation, but start at the level of persons. Right? What is a person? Once we see what a person is, we see that ChatGPT is not a person. And so you can't have a conversation in the full proper sense. And I guess one other thing, like, I mean, if they think this, that means they're probably not having real conversations with other people also. So sort of developing the art of conversation and learning to have a real conversation in which you make a gift of yourself is a key first step too.
Mark, thank you. I want to start out by saying that I agree with every word of the talk, so thank you. But since that's not very helpful for a conversation in this context, I want to try to see if I can formulate an objection in defense, kind of speak on defense of individualism, but maybe drawing on some ideas from personalists to see if we can coherently do that and to see if in raising this objection, we might better clarify some fundamental concepts of the personalist tradition, especially concerning community. So you spoke about responding to the value of community as such, and you spoke of community as a kind of reality that is more than just the individual persons involved, and I think that's right. But I think it does sort of raise the question of, well, what kind of reality is that, and what would it mean to respond to or to care for my marriage as such?
Yeah.
Now, Edith Stein addresses questions like this in her contributions to the philosophy of psychology and the humanities, addressing the relation of the individual and the community, person and community. And what she notices is that yes, there are these communal realities, but they're always born in and by individuals. I think that if we look at that and we recognize that point, that community is not some sort of free-floating higher we that's over and above the individual I's that make it up, then in looking at my marriage and asking, well, how do I work on my marriage? It's not by addressing marriage as some sort of third term, but it's by addressing the person of my wife.
Right.
And it's by looking to her individual needs. I want to spend time with her. I want to do the things that she likes to do. And I could see a individualist making the argument and say, yeah, exactly that. We are just individuals responding to each other individually, and if the means of looking after my marriage is to look at my wife's individual needs and make sure she has her private goods, well, doesn't that just prove the individualist framework? So I wonder how you might respond to an objection that looks like that maybe takes advantage of some of our personalist phenomenological tradition and says, we were right all along.
Yeah, thank you. I thought you were going to start, there's the old joke, I agreed with every word you said, just not in the order you put them in. Thought you might say, but thanks. So I'm also sympathetic to this objection as well. But I think I want to push back on it a little bit. I think I want to say that in some sense, my marriage is a distinct thing from me and my spouse. That when we come together in a particular way, right, by saying and doing the things that constitute a marriage, a new reality comes into existence. And part of the sign of this, part of the evidence for this, is that when I work on my marriage, I need to not just address my wife's individual needs and desires. I should do that, of course, but not just do that, but also sort of think about what is it to be in a marriage? Like there are certain things that married people ought to do just because they're married, right? Certain ways they ought to relate just because they're married, that are not there when they are not married. And so thinking about sort of the form or structure of marriage, some personalists talk about these communities as a gestalt, right? This sort of new unity that we can perceive. We can perceive it as a whole that comes into existence. Yes, of course, through individual persons' actions and individual persons responding to value, but as something enduring and something that confers certain duties upon the members. Marriage is a trickier case, of course, because it can't endure past the death of one of its members. But in other cases, it's maybe easier to see, say in the case of a nation, which endures even when all of the original members are dead. So there we can see that by being a citizen of a particular nation, I've sort of been incorporated into this larger form, this larger structure, gestalt, which requires me to act in new ways I didn't have to act before. When you think about a gestalt, I think it's a helpful analogy sort of to an artwork. An artwork is a gestalt, a new form, right? You take individual paint and you put it together into a larger painting. And even though there's a sense in which what really substantially exists is the particular bits of paint, the canvas, they have somehow constituted this new whole because they're united by a particular value. And that's the sense in which I want to say, experientially, there's a new whole over and above the individuals.
So we'll take two more questions, Peter and then Juan Manuel. And as you said before, you're just setting up conversations for the rest of our time together.
And I'm always happy to talk, after this. We can talk about anything.
Mark, thank you. That was, as always, admirably clear, very rich. You've given a sort of robust, unified theory of community, right, ranging from two-people interactions up to, I guess, all of humanity in the church.
Yeah.
And I wonder if I could get you to say something about the relevance of thinking in terms of different kinds of community. And the particular reason I ask, quite apart from my own interests, is that when I think about the account you gave of individualism, it drew very heavily, almost entirely, on ideas developed in relation to the state, especially social contract thought. You named Hobbes and Locke and Mill and Rawls. And when I think about the account you gave of the personalist vision of community, it drew very heavily upon the marriage relationship.
Yep.
And there might be quite good reasons to think of those relationships, those communities, as very different and perhaps as operating on different kinds of principles. So could you at least, you may have been toward the end of your talk actually trying to put that off for another occasion, but could you at least gesture in the direction of that concern?
Sure, yeah. So this is similar to the earlier question about value and the call of value. I'm speaking here at a sort of very general level, but in order to really understand these things, we have to drill down and think about what are the particular ways things show up as valuable, or what are the particular sorts of communities that actually exist. And yes, each community has a distinct structure. So yeah, I'm focusing heavily on marriage as my paradigm case, as Hildebrand himself does. And marriage is, while it has formal aspects, it has a contractual aspect to it, legal aspect to it. It's also a material community. It's founded upon shared loves and shared way of life and so forth. And that makes it very different from a formal community like the state. And so yeah, there's a sense in which aspects of the contractarian or individualist view are going to be retained probably in a plausible account of the state, but not exclusively, right? So a state is also is not just formed by people who, hey, we happen to live in the same area and we don't want to kill each other, so let's form this government that will protect us from each other. A state is also based in a shared way of life, right? A state is generally based in a nation, right? In a culture, or a tribe, or some other group like that. And a nation or a culture or a tribe is a lot more like a marriage, right? It's about people coming together in terms of shared loves and shared way of life and so forth. So I think the personalist can allow that while there are contractual aspects of the state, we need to have this sort of deeper, more material base to it. But again, yeah, thinking through the different kinds of communities and how they're essentially related to one another is key for that. And Hildebrand spends a lot of the metaphysics of community talking about those relationships. We'll talk more about this later.
Well, thank you. My question was very similar to the question that I think Tullius said before. So probably, well, my idea is that what would be the essence of the community and the difference with the idea of the point is like the interpersonal relationship. We do this relation between others, but the community is something different, no? So what would be the difference between this essence of community and the interpersonal relationship? But I said this question is very similar to the question that Tullius said. That so, you want to to answer this or?
Yeah. So between the sort of community in the proper sense and interpersonal relationships in this broader sense, yeah. So just like I guess I've answered a number of the other questions, I kind of see this as a continuum in a sense. And Dr. Federica is going to talk a lot more about this in 2 days. So she'll give us a much more robust account of community in the proper sense. But just like with, say, conversation, we've got sort of conversation in the broad, diffuse sense of just any exchange of words or exchange of information, all the way to conversation in the proper sense of like the full giving and receiving of persons through words. I think we can see a similar sort of continuum when it comes to community. Anytime two people interact, there's a kind of community that comes into existence, right? At least for a moment, at least for the time the two people are talking, these persons have been sort of enmeshed within a larger whole. But it's something fleeting and something that doesn't last past the end of the conversation. All the way to something like the church, which would be sort of community in the most fullest sense because it's eternal. And it's a participation in the Trinitarian life. So there we would have sort of community in the sense of this full new reality, sort of quasi-personal, quasi-substantial reality that binds all the people together into this new whole. And everything else would fall somewhere in between on this continuum.
In this sense, the community wouldn't be too general. So in the sense that maybe a community, we use a term that to very different things. We can apply to an analogical sense of the term community, but if we use the same term to something like a simple interpersonal relationship to a very great thing like the church of the state, maybe we won't have a problem there with the term.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we need to be clear about which sense of community we're using. And so that's why this distinction between narrow and broad sense of community that Hildebrand has, broad in the sense of just general interpersonal relationships, narrow in the sense of some enduring new reality. That distinction, I think, needs to be kept front and center in our minds. And anytime we talk about community, we should specify which sense we mean it in.
Just very briefly to look ahead on Hildebrand, I don't know whether you'll find it convincing. He'll actually say there are new principles involved when it comes to community in this proper sense, in the narrow sense. So even though there is some continuity, he also thinks that there is something fundamentally new that enters in, and that's what we're going to talk about on Wednesday. So hopefully your question will be answered there, at least from Hildebrand's perspective.
Well, can we have a round of applause for Mark?
Thank you.